So first, thank you to Joseph Bedford who organized this discussion. Thank you to Virgin Tech and Cooper Union. Thank you, of course, to the four speakers, so Peggy Demer, John Ockman, Michael Jung, and Anthony Wittler, for their inspiring comments. So I have been asked to divide my presentation in two parts. First, you commenting individually on the four papers, and then giving my own take on the question. Well, how does architecture distribute the sensible? Well, I think the first question is how we interpret the how itself, And what is interesting that Peggy Demer did it in a very literal way. She translated the proposition into a precise question: what is the architectural object that best satisfies my way of conceptualizing that distribution? Now, she did it within a specific framework borrowed from the economic production consumption paradigm. She asked how architectural objects could satisfy a specific consumer that would be the proletariat in my own historical narrative, or the salaried worker in the contemporary context of financial capital. She selects, I would say, three candidates for the role of the good object. The first is an object able to satisfy the desires of the new consumer, the retrofilling of three buildings made by Lacaton and Vassal, who clipped on the facades a new layer that the dwellers could use as they liked. Well, but the problem is that, of course, art in the aesthetic regime is not so much destined for satisfying consumers as for dissatisfying them. I mean, wresting the bodies from their places through experiences of defamiliarization. This is why I think she finds precisely this defamiliarization in a second form of architectural accomplishment, an installation made by John Whiteman to blur three major oppositions: male and female, privacy and togetherness, ordinary and extraordinary. Yet she thinks that the example is not convincing because it is no real architectural practice. I would say it is not so, or for another reason, because it is still the performance of an artist who wants to determine the behavior of a viewer. That's why in the third example that she has selected, the architect thwarts her own mastery and the technological perfection of the digital age by privileging forms of drawing open to randomness and, I quote, close to feminine labor, domestic labor. Well, this self-denial revives the Ruskinian idea of the artist as an artisan. But it's not enough to provide us with the good object. Therefore, Peggy Demer concludes that her method of the fool's errand has failed. But two different conclusions that can be drawn from that failure. The first is that architecture resists my theorization of the aesthetic regime, which calls into question either architecture because of its subservience to capitalism, or my own conceptualization because it doesn't address that dependency of architecture upon capitalism. Well, I would suggest that there is another conclusion. What our demonstration may suggest is that we must interpret differently the how of the question. The issue cannot be addressed, I would say, as a search for the good object conceived in the framework of a producer-consumer relationship. But the fact is that my analysis of the aesthetic regime does not give criteria or yardsticks for good objects. The 14 scenes of aesthesis are not narratives of good artistic production or good artistic consumers' reception. They are scenes of emergence and metamorphosis. They show how something happens, which alters the norms of the artistic and displaces the lines of separation between art and non-art, popular art and high art, action and suspension, whole and fragment, etc. Well, I try to spell out the alterations that is happening produces in the realm of the perceptible and the thinkable, and finally, in the very order that puts things and people in their place. Well, those shifts in the realm of artistic experience, I think, don't produce objects satisfying the workers. They produce something different, an egalitarian reconfiguration of the forms of common experience, in which work itself included. For work is not only the name of an activity, but that of a category in the distribution of the sensible. A worker is not only a human being who works hard and doesn't earn much. It is somebody who is assigned to an impoverished form of experience, governed by utility. So what's important then is how the transformations of artistic experience undo the hierarchical oppositions between the useful and the artistic, or the high and the popular. And architecture precisely intervenes in aesthesis in two scenes that are not specifically devoted to architecture, but that record disruptions of that kind. One which disrupts the hierarchical distinction between art and artisanry by turning a piece of furniture into a temple, and the other which upsets the Aristotelian privilege of the dramatic poet over the prop maker and turns the theater into a cathedral. Well, John Hockman precisely focuses on this second mode of implication of architecture in aesthesis. Its implication in the invention of the art of mise en scène. Well, at first sight, this implication may seem modest. Appia, Craig, and their followers saw architecture as the anti-representative art that must replace the painted decors and help displace the theatrical performance from the interpretation of a story to an autonomous performance of the body. Indeed, the stairs, platforms, or rhythmic spaces that they draw don't require a high level of mathematical science and technological perfection. But the perspective is different if we think of it in terms of distribution of the sensible. Because in this context, the theatrical action is a performance of the bodies happening in a place where people gather, but also a place where their gathering is structured by a separation commented by John Hockman, the separation between the stage and the hall. And that separation between those who act and those who look, in turn serves as a metaphor for a society divided between active and passive men. This is what gives its full meaning to the connection of theater and architecture. Both arts are powerful metaphors of the social order, and metaphors are not mere figurative language. They are agents which actually shape the form of our being together. So at the core of this shaping, I think, there is the complex relationships between six terms, which may be coupled or uncoupled in various ways. Those six terms are acting and viewing, separation and community, equality and inequality. Well, the dominant interpretation puts spectatorship, separation, and inequality on the same side, which is, of course, the bad side. Therefore, the abolition of the separation and the becoming active of the spectators are often seen as conditions for an egalitarian redistribution of the sensible. Well, I have questioned this dominant interpretation by emphasizing both the activity of the passive spectator and the positive role of aesthetic separation. To that end, I borrowed from Mallarmé the sentence, "Separated we are together," which summarizes the paradox of the aesthetic effect, separation as togetherness, inactivity as action. Joan Hockman shares my view, but she doesn't want it to remain an abstract idea. She wants to give separation a materiality, to embody it in a specific apparatus. And she shows this principle already materialized in the theatrical dispositif that she had imagined long ago, a twofold dispositif of separation, isolating the spectators from each other and from the stage. Against the audience walls, the spectators are isolated in boxes, but they see themselves together as a collective in the mirrors of the curtain wall. This retractable curtain wall seems to reconcile all the contradictions. It gives a solid materiality to the principle of separation, which, in my view, produces the aesthetic effect of subversion of the ordinary, which means of consensual order. But on the other hand, it fulfills the dream of Appia and his followers, the dream of the active space. The space becomes itself a performer. The third wall then becomes, I think, another incarnation of the good object. But a good object of a paradoxical kind, of course, since it is destined to produce the specific effect of a loss of destination. Well, Anthony Widler, for his part, doesn't look for the object that would satisfy my notion of the distribution of the sensible. Well, in a way, architecture always satisfies it. In the time of Enlightenment, it laid claim to a specific science of distribution, putting geometry at the service of the social distribution of places and function. But in a sense, architecture as an art of distributing spaces has always served the distribution of the sensible, which could be defined in a way as the sense of the place, the material and symbolic ordering that puts individuals and groups at the places suitable for their identity, function, and capacity. As such, also, it could serve the ends of utopia, because utopia can be conceived as a form of redistribution of the sensible. Utopia affirms that the social order putting people in their place is a wrong order. People do not occupy in society the places suiting their identities and capacities. So the task of correcting that discordance is given to the science of distribution of spaces, namely architecture. With the help of architecture, the U of utopia no longer makes it a non-place. Instead, it means a good place, a utopia, within which capacities and places are in accordance. But there is a problem with this solution. The architect, as such, knows only one part of the job, distributing spaces. It is the utopist who knows the other part, the capacities to be distributed at their right place. But what is the major capacity denied by the old hierarchical distribution? The answer is simple. It is the capacity for mobility. The utopist then must play the part of a super architect who invents the well-partitioned space suitable for people who don't hold in place. Such is Fourier's problem, distributing the apartments of the phalanstère according to a classification of passions and to which is mobile itself. And architecture has not enough artifacts at hand to match that distribution of mobilities. So the good place, the place that gives its material reality to the right distribution of bodies, is a place that cannot be drawn, and let alone built. Well, Anthony Widler pits that inachievable task against another form of redistribution of the sensible, one that is embodied in my work by the joiner, dreamer, walker, philosopher Goni, and that I proposed to call heterotopia. But I don't intend heterotopia in the sense of Foucault, because Foucault made it another figure of that unheimlich, which fascinated his generation. But heterotopia for me is not a place. It's a process of observation of places and reappropriation of space, which can take on many forms. Well, in the case of Goni, the joiner, it starts with the look across the window, which subverts its relation to the space of property. It goes on through the promenade and propaganda in the sinuous streets of the city. And it finds its accomplishments in the dream of a future Liberia, which will not be a city of apartments suitable for workers, but an open space of promenade, revelry, and discussion among temples, porticos, columns, etc. So a very specific kind of architecture, looking like the follies of 18th century gardens, which imitated the imaginary landscapes painted by Claude Lorrain. Well, we can say, or we reach this kind of paradoxical conclusion that the architecture that best suits the capacity for mobility might be an architecture of drawings and etchings. Well, I will come back over the implication of this paradox for architecture itself. Well, Michael Young puts the question the other way around. He doesn't focus on the architectural works that may verify my notion of the distribution of the sensible. Instead, he raises the question how that notion, along with my division of the three regimes of art, affects architecture itself as a practice. The question then is no longer how does architecture produce effects which confirm or disrupt the hierarchical order, but how is this hierarchical order present in the very idea and practice of architecture? Well, he sees this hierarchical order at work in the traditional opposition of two terms, drawing and image. The drawing of the architect is the visualization of the abstract idea of the edifice to be built, and it initiates a global process of control over the implementation of the idea. As such, it appears to be the exact opposite of the image, which only gives a copy of the appearance of things. In that sense, architecture interrupts the reign of the image. This is one of the two meanings of his ambiguous title, The Interruption of the Image. Well, such is the traditional view of architecture, which is a compromise between the logics of two regimes, the ethical and the representational. Both concur in a view of architecture as the art that gives an idea its exact material implementation. Well, it seems, however, that this traditional balance has been altered in modern and postmodern times. So there is a question, what is the force responsible for this imbalance? The usual answer to such questions is search on the side of the power in charge of implementing ideas in the material world, namely technology. Well, then the digital technology would be the power altering the traditional path from the intelligible to the sensible, along the traditional balance between the representational and the ethical regime. Well, against this analysis, Michael Young pits an overnight proposition. It is not the technological change that is the cause of aesthetic transformations. Instead, it is the aesthetic transformations that determine the mode of intervention of the technological change. What is then the change carried out by the aesthetic regime of art? Well, it can be answered that it disrupts the traditional hierarchy between the intelligible and the sensible. And at the core of this subversion, there is the redefinition of the image, of the idea of image. An image is not a copy of empirical appearances. It is a process of alteration, a desensual process that alters the very distribution of resemblance and dissemblance, reality and appearance, and the intelligible and the sensible. So which alters, at the same time, our very sense of the real. Well, thus, the meaning of Michael Young's title can be overturned. The image interrupts the traditional form of the architectural process and the hierarchical order that it implied. If the image is redefined as a process of alteration, An architect's drawing is an image as well as a sketch, a photographical rendering, or an axiometric representation. And the digital technology lends its resources to a plurality of image functions. Well, how does this form of equality affect the very idea of architecture? This is, in my view, the questions which underpins Michael Young's reference to collage. Collage is par excellence a practice of indistinction, which makes images by sticking together heterogeneous forms of materiality and heterogeneous modes of imageness. By the same token, it is a practice of indistinction of the arts. What is at stake in the work of Archigram or Superstudio is not the application of the practice of collage to the construction of edifices. No, it is a disidentification of architecture. Architecture becomes a form of reconfiguration of the common space or the space of the common, which may take on several forms, designing buildings, of course, but also producing images of space, images of architectures, text on space and architecture, and so on. All activities which take part in a redistribution of the sensible, though they build nothing, or even because they build nothing. Well, this paradox of an architecture that doesn't build and perhaps must not build might be a good transition to my own interpretation of the issue. How does architecture distribute the sensible? Well, let us start from the fact that architecture is a particular case of a broader problem, which concerns all arts, since it concerns the very concept of art. The word art means two things at once. An art, first, is a technique, the implementation of a specific knowledge. Now, this implementation is the means to a certain end. As such, an art also is the index of a place in a distribution of human activities and human ends. This distribution is not only material, but also symbolic. Any technical knowledge is subservient to a higher knowledge, the knowledge of the end that it serves and the place of that end in a hierarchy of ends and activities. Well, Plato clearly made the point, The saddler's art serves the ends of cavalry. Cavalry serves the ends of the city serves the ends of the idea of the good. But the idea of the good serves no ends. It is perfect in itself. So the hierarchy that makes all art subservient to the knowledge of their ends serves a higher hierarchy that makes all ends subservient to a good that is an end in itself. Art, then, in general, is a site of a polarization between two kinds of perfection. The perfection of a mode of doing, which serves definite ends, and the perfection of a mode of being, which consists in being one's own end. An art may require considerable knowledge and skill, while remaining in the hierarchical tradition a mechanical art, an art destined for utilitarian ends and practiced by artisans, also called mechanical men. To those mechanical arts, an antique hierarchy opposed the liberal arts. What made them liberal was not the excellence of the skills that they required, but the quality of those who practiced them. Free men were called free because they did not have to lend their arms for earning their livings, and could practice those arts as the activities just suiting that freedom. So the perfection of an art as a mode of doing appears to be the exact contrary of its perfection as a mode of being. And the complex history of the arts must be thought, I think, against the backdrop of this seminal hierarchy of activities and modes of being. Well, in that frame, the first problem for architecture is not what effects does the architectural practice carry out in the social order. It is how this practice is itself situated in the material and symbolic distributions of the activities and modes of being. Well, the point is that architecture embodies the first form of perfection, technological perfection at the highest degree. It is seen as the art of the perfect adjustment of all means to an end and all parts to a whole. As such, it is a model not only for the other arts, but for all forms of human action that aspire to a perfect means to ends and part to all adjustment. However, this perfection has its flip side. The architectural practice cannot be its own end. It always produces something outside itself, a building serving specific ends determined by an external power. Hence, the paradoxical situation of architecture in the representational regime of art. It provided all arts with the formula, with the good formula, for their own perfection, the paths to all adjustment. Nevertheless, it was set aside, in the classification of the fine arts. In a canonical book, Les Beaux-Arts réduits à un seul principe, published in 1746, Charles Batteux put the mathematical science of the architects and the empirical art of the orators in the same category. Both were pushed onto the margins because they served utilitarian ends, whereas the fine arts have only one end, the beautiful, and try to reach it by imitating nature instead of using its products. Well, one could think that the aesthetic revolution released architecture from that situation, since it broke not only the representational norms of beauty, but the whole hierarchical distribution that underpinned them. In the experience of the beautiful, said Kant, the appreciation of the form of an object is separated from both the concept that it implements and the ends that it serves. In judging the beauty of a palace, we don't take into account the plans of the architect and the dignity of those who dwell in the palace. Its facade stands as a free appearance, which is the object of a free play of our faculties, and that's all. Well, Schiller emphasized the significance of that free play. He made it an experience of freedom and equality, released from both the constraints of utility and those of hierarchy. Well, play is the mode of activity that ignores the very distinction of means and ends. As such, it bears the promise of a world to come where the hierarchy of ends and the very distinction of ends and means will be abolished, not only in the sphere of art, but on the whole surface of human experience. Well, this is the core of the redistribution of the sensible that Schiller defines as an aesthetic education of mankind. This is also the core of the definition of communism in Marx's manuscripts of 1844, the state in which the generic activity of human beings will no longer be carried out as a means for earning one's livings, but pursued for itself. The only difference, and not a small one, of course, is that Marx calls this generic activity work, while Schiller called it play. Unfortunately, this new horizon made the position of architecture perhaps still more paradoxical. The paradox can be summed up in one single question. How is it possible to build a free appearance? How can you build edifices without a concept of the ends of that they must serve and the form that they must have? How eliminate in the practice of architecture the ends to means distinction and the hierarchical ordering that it implies, and which works also as a paradigm for the social distribution of ranks? Architecture was the technical art obliged to obey the ends of social hierarchy. It might have become, in the aesthetic regime, the hierarchical art obliged to play its part in a historical process leading to the abolition of that hierarchy. This paradoxical knot of equality and inequality takes on the specific aspect of a tension between the facade, promising equality to all viewers, according to Kant, and the volume, putting all activities and people in their place. Well, that tension is at the very heart of the aesthetic regime and of its potential of equality. Well, in the time of Kant and Schiller, Claude Nicolas Ledoux still thought it possible to use the science of distribution to build edifices exactly fitting the social needs while expressing their social role in the lines of their facades. But those two perfections are not only different, they contradict each other. One must choose between the functional and the symbolic. This is not my own statement. But this is the lesson delivered by the fascinating section that Hegel devotes to architecture in his lessons on aesthetics. Architecture is an art to the extent that it is imperfect, but it cannot reach its ends. It is not the house made for the needs of the individuals which is the origin of architecture. It is a temple, which gives a community its sacred seal. But the temple gathers people and symbolizes this gathering insofar as it is not a functional building intended for housing God or even for serving God. Instead, it is a piling of stones which says that God is not here and that no building can reach God. The Hegelian history of architecture starts with an edifice that cannot be built, the Tower of Babel, and it finds its supreme accomplishment with the Gothic cathedral, whose spires tend towards an inaccessible God. The geometric perfection of the Vitruvian temple is only a parenthesis between those two imperfections in which architecture fulfills its task as a symbolic art by not reaching its ends as a technical art. Well, I think that Hegel's provocative text may help us question some false evidences concerning modernity and postmodernity. First, the evidence of a pre-established harmony between aesthetic modernity, technological revolution, and social revolution. Next, that of a break between a modernist architecture enticed with functionality, machines, straight angles, and rough materials, and a postmodern one enticed with voids, curves, and waves, or signs, texts, and duck rabbits. Those oppositions are blurred from the outset. The line that goes from the factories designed in the 1770s by Claude Nicolas Ledoux to the turbine hall designed in 1909 by Peter Behrens is not a straight line on which new architects used in turn the technological progress to achieve the same project of a modern architecture serving the needs of modern society. Between Ledoux and Behrens, there is the radical torsion addressed by Peggy Dimmer, in her presentation. So the torsion brought by Ruskin in the very idea of progress. To go forward as a force of social progress, he states, architecture must make a move backward towards Gothic art. The art of those cathedrals that were never completed, never conformed to the initial plans of the architect, always imperfect, because imperfection is the mark of progress, the mark of a free people who is not submitted to the tyranny of an architect and the tyranny of the division of labor. Well, constructing buildings has become part of a process of construction of a new sensible world. The line of progress, thus, is a broken line where the improvement of architecture as a practice serving social needs also means the progress of the imperfection, allowing it to construct a fabric of sensible equality. So behind the easy question, how can architecture adapt its knowledge to the requirements of social progress and the needs of the working class, there is a much more radical question. How can architecture become imperfect? How can it undo its own mastery to create a new sensible world where human beings freely play with free appearances? Architecture is used to build walls which close the space and separate people and activities. How can it do the opposite, break the walls in order to link spaces and people? It gives people a residence for them to stay. How can it make them move and move with them to espouse the movement of life which never stays? Well, for connecting and mobilizing people instead of separating and housing them, architecture must acquire apparently two specific properties: continuity or unseparateness and mobility. Not only two properties that it lacks, but two properties which contradict its own perfection. My point is that it cannot acquire them through its own development. It can do so only through a process of disidentification that makes it encounter in a paradoxical and even conflictual way other arts, the arts of those who don't build anything solid and useful, the arts of the flat surfaces, those of the ephemeral movement, and ultimately the art that is no art at all. Well, I will briefly comment on two of these encounters which deal with the issues of continuity and mobility. Let us start with continuity. In the time of Kant, Schiller, and Ledoux, which was also the time of the French Revolution, there was an art in which there was a huge debate on this notion of continuity. It was the art of landscape gardening. In 1794, came out in London a book whose complete title was An Essay of the Picturesque as Compared with the Sublime and the Beautiful, and on the use of studying pictures for the purpose of improving real landscapes. Well, his author was Udall Price, a landlord, who was also an art connoisseur. The book was a long polemics against the dominant trend in English landscape gardening. The English gardeners pitted the right angles and the symmetry of the French gardens against the freedom of the English garden, with its open spaces, its serpentine lines, and its mellow undulation. That could be illustrated here, by the Park of Harewood, designed by the famous landscape architect of that time, Capability Brown. Well, Price and his friends contended that the new style resulted in the same stiffness and uniformity as the French garden. Well, an architectural will had destroyed the natural landscape by leveling the ground, creating artificial undulations or false lakes, and clearing the natural interlacing of the trees. To really improve landscapes, he stated, one must borrow the characteristics of the art that shaped them, the art with which nature itself constructs her own scenes. Those characteristics are continuity, connection, and intricacy. The scenes of nature present those properties because nature is a very peculiar artist, an artist who doesn't want to make art. Therefore, she ignores the means to ends and the part to all relationships that characterizes the art of the will and, of course, most peculiarly, architecture. So the kind of unity that nature deploys is a general sympathy, an intricacy that links all the elements without subordinating any of them. Nature connects because she lets everything mix without any hierarchy. The model of this anti-architectural unity is given by the tree. I quote, It is composed of millions of boughs, sprays, and leaves, intermixed and crossing each other in as many directions, while through the various openings the eye still discovers new and infinite combinations of them. Yet the general effect is as simple as the detail is complicated. Well, this might be illustrated by this tree painted by Gainsborough, which was also a tree in the park of Uvedal Price. Well, how imitate this power of free and equal connection within human art? Well, the answer is here, in a way. Price answers that there is an art that sets to work the virtues of sympathy and intricacy, painting. Painting, the art of the surface, is the true art of continuity, which also means the art of freedom and equality. Unlike the landowners and their landscape architects, who clear the ground and remove poor people and poor housing from their view, painters give the same attention to the peasants' cottages, carts, and cattle as they do to the magnificence of legendary heroes and antique temples. Well, here Price explicitly refers to the master of landscape painting, Claude Lorrain, whose imaginary landscapes, he says, let the luxuriant branches of the trees stretch across the magnificent columns and porticos of the palaces and temples. Well, we may find a bit modest the intricacy of architecture and vegetation presented by Lorrain's painting. But the contemporaries of Price find the very idea extravagant. They say this is the best way to have a damp and unhealthy home. It is architecture made for viewers, not for dwellers. Unwittingly, I think they gave the exact formulation of the problem whose solution was proposed more than a century later by Frank Lloyd Wright when he used the new materials offered by glass, steel, and concrete to build houses like this one, which, of course, became a symbol of modern architecture. What strikes us in the images of falling water is not only the integration of the construction in its natural site, it is that the materials and the building and the very organization of the space tend to present the same properties as the natural site. In this image, the ceiling seems to bend towards the panes of glass in the same way as the sky does on the horizon. And the furniture looks like islets on the surface of a lake. It reminds me of this painting, of a lake, which is a kind of symbol, of the English lakes of Derwentwater in Cumberland. Well, by giving a three-dimensional reality to the idea of continuity elaborated at the crossroads of painting and landscaping, the architects also solved the paradox of modern architecture and achieved its own dream. Architecture can destroy the walls. Not only can the architect put the inside outside and the outside inside, he can also eliminate all separations and fixtures. And, I quote Frank Lloyd Wright, let the walls, ceilings, floors become seen, he emphasized seen, become seen as components, parts of each other, their surfaces flowing into each other. End of quote. So the art of the wheel has incorporated the properties of its contrary, the unconscious art of nature. Now, this disidentification is described in terms that I think deserve our attention. Surfaces flowing into each other. Well, this is how Winkelmann famously described the torso of the Belvedere, as a continuous movement of waves falling onto each other. This is how Winkelmann turned an imperfect statue, a mutilated statue, into a new paradigm of the beautiful, expressing the freedom and equality of a people the Greek people, unaware of the division of labor. And this is also how architecture now describes the achievement of its impossible task. Walls are vanishing, there are no more walls, and the place for dwelling is exactly the same as a place for seeing. Well, however, the question takes on a new aspect. What is the exact relationship between the movement of this flowing and that of social emancipation? Well, the problem is not that falling water is not exactly a house for the working class. In the redistribution of the sensible, the identity between a dwelling and a vista might weigh more than the construction of solid houses for workers. I evoked earlier, after Anthony Wedler, how workers' emancipation started with the transformation of a place for working into a place for seeing. But it is precisely at this point of equivalence, that the architectural transformation of walls into waves diverges from the path of emancipation. Because between the workplace, where the joiner dissociated the freedom of his gaze from the servitude of his hands, and the town of the future with its antique porticos where you would enjoy revelry, leisure, and discussion, there are the sinuous streets of the town where he meets other workers, the streets where workers sometimes gather to raise their own unachieved constructions, to redistribute the spaces and restage in their own way the relationship between the construction of buildings and the construction of a new sensible world. So this kind of construction, So in June 1848, in Paris, in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine in Paris. Well, many elements in the image, which has been made, of course, by an enemy, by a bourgeois enemy, many elements in the image, emphasize the theatrical aspect, of the barricade, and notably, of course, the placard, wearing the word complet, which means in French, sold out. But the most important point is that this theater is made of heteroclite materials, carts and wheels, but also furniture and mattresses, which blur the distinctions between work and home, public and private, etc. This confusion of spaces is clearly at odds with the architectural dream of continuity. The latter implies that the space must never be blocked. Everybody should circulate freely. Thus, the principle of continuity in modern architecture is usually accompanied by a new principle of separation, which was most clearly formulated by Le Corbusier, but broadly shared by most architects committed with social progress. The space for dwelling and the space for circulation must be separated. Cars circulate freely at the lower level. Pedestrians circulate freely at the upper level. But what has become impossible is that pedestrians turn cars upside down to construct barricades and construct themselves as a new political people. So the process for which architecture contradicts itself by dissolving the walls into flowing landscapes reaches its limits in terms of distribution of the sensible. And this is perhaps the point where the imperative of mobility enters the scene. What is required, for architecture to espouse, this movement is a mobility more mobile than that of the flowing surfaces, closer to that of the insurgent bodies and their constructions. Again, architecture could not acquire by its own development that anti-architectural virtue, even with the help of the new techniques and the new materials. It could only acquire them through a process of disidentification. One agent of that disidentification might have been its encounter with an other art, and it was the subject of John Ockman's paper, the art of the performing bodies. Between the theatrical barricades of 19th century revolutions and the architecture of the Soviet Revolution, there was the scenographic revolution initiated by Adolph Appia and Edward Gordon Craig, and followed by Meyerhold and other Soviet stage directors. At the heart of that revolution, there was the will to turn an art of words into an art of movement. This transformation could be thought of in various, if not opposite ways. Appia called for an architecture of the stage supporting the action of the moving bodies. He wanted it to be, this architecture, to be not only a technical dispositif, but an agent in the process of creating a new civilization of the living body where art would no more be separated from life. That's why he also called for the abolition of the separation between the stage and the hall into a unique space. Well, in the creation of that undivided space should prolong the union of architecture and body, and it should symbolize a society which does no longer separate active and passive human beings. Well, Craig interpreted quite differently the imperative of mobility. He did not want art to become collective life. Instead, he wanted it to affirm its distance in order to play its role as a force of intensification of life. That's why he wanted the stage to move itself, to be divided, fragmented, in many squares, climbing up and down, so with kind of dramaturgy of the space, replacing the worn-out rhetoric of the expression of passions by the actors. But significantly, however, both Appia and Craig selected the same architectural artifact to embody the union of architecture and movement. This architectural artifact was a very modest one, the stairs, the constructions which are, in fact, which are no overuse, except that of allowing movement. But precisely it is for that reason that it could become the architectural actor of a revolution, making movement its own end, which can be illustrated here by some images of Craig's, dreamed, silent drama, The Steps, or by Appia's staging or famous staging of Orpheus and Eurydice in the unseparated space of the Aero Theatre. So that was evoked earlier by John Ockman. Well, the stairs are both the instrument and the symbol of a movement that has become an end in itself. If the tree proposed the model of a democratic distribution of space, the stairs can symbolize communism as the form of life where work and play have become the same activity. Well, as a matter of fact, Soviet architecture seems to have been polarized after the revolution between two architectural models, which are also two paradigms of the distribution of the sensible. A monumental architecture intended for giving to people and activities the place that best suits them, so in a tradition of Ledoux. And on the other side, a theatrical architecture intended for symbolizing the new form of life, the form of a collective movement of the people that is its own end. Many architectural projects of the time seem to have been inspired by the stage designs of revolutionary theater, making the stage a machine of movement and a machine for movement. As is illustrated by the scenography imagined by Lyubov Popova from Cromling's magnificent Cuckold, or Tretyakov, The Hearse in Turmoil. A scenography which is both a practical dispositif for ceaseless movement of the bodies, and an emblematic visualization of the identity of work, play, and collective action, which also evokes the bric-a-brac of the barricades. Well, I think that many architectural projects of the time look like stage design. For instance, between, Alexander Vesnin, stage set for The Man Who Was Thursday, and his project for a Palace of Labor. There is a similarity that reveals more than the style of an individual and many other projects, like this sketch for a communal house, or this sketch for the building for a newspaper. Well, homage to the aesthetic of the revolutionary stage, which owed much itself to the paradigm of the stairs. It is true that some housing projects found a more direct inspiration in industrial progress. For instance, Sergei Krutikov's project of a flying city drew on the evolution of the means of transport, which he thought tended towards the same form, an oblong cabin in which the space occupied by the mechanism gradually decreased, and left a wider and wider space for living. Thus, at the end, a same cellular form would meet the needs of transport and those of housing moving people. Yes, Krutikov's project of the flying city, or so-called flying city, still looks like a theatrical stage design. And the union of architecture, transportation, and moving bodies, which was the end of the flying city, was in some way anticipated in the springboards, tractors, and cranes in Popova's scenography. Well, I'm not arguing about matters of precedence, no. I'm just stressing the role of those transitional spaces within which arts and techniques lose their identity and exchange their properties. In contradiction, of course, with the so-called modernist idea of the arts becoming autonomous and concentrating on their own materials and procedures. It is in that space of disidentification that architecture could go astray from its own perfection and integrate the properties it was lacking to define its own place and role in the aesthetic revolution and the social revolution. Well, it might be told that this conjunction between the aesthetic revolution and the social revolution, well, is not exactly, the context in which we can think of architecture today. Again, things are more intricate. The fact is that the aspirations to continuity and mobility have never ceased inspiring architectural projects up to our present, skipping over the alleged end of utopias and the alleged break between modern and postmodern architecture. So Frank Lloyd Wright wanted the ceilings, walls, and floors to become one unique space, making the inside and the outside not only connected, but similar to each other. I think the same imperative was still at work in emblematic projects of the end of the 20th century, like Rem Koolhaas' Bibliothèque Jussieu. The space of the library, he said, must be continuous. A unique ramp, then, should go from the ground to the roof and constitute the space of a strong, along which the shelves of the books become features of the landscapes, like the furniture in Wright's villas. That's why, in fact, the problem is that the space of the library can hardly be represented, by a small-scale model like this, which inevitably makes it a box. It is much more adequately represented by the pages of a book, where the profile of the buildings, the lines of a text, and the rhythm of the hand that turns the pages become the same time space of a walk. However, this walk has become a stroll through the urban landscape, a Benjaminian walk through the past of the town, through the obsolete construction into which its dreams of future have been sealed. Continuity and movement still constitute the telos that guides architecture, even though it is the two-dimensional surface of a book which is the site of this movement. It is true that the search for mobility is now disconnected from the one-way time of progress, the time oriented by a promise of equality and freedom that sustained it. But it seems that architecture has precisely appropriated for itself the imperative of movement that was once the imperative of revolutionary fighters. That shift was well illustrated recently by the project called the Architectural Imagination, presented 3 years ago at the Venice Biennale of Architecture. Architects had been asked to imagine forms of rejuvenation of some areas in Detroit, of course, an emblematic town devastated by the decline of the car industry. But significantly, however, it was no more in the old manner for the architect a question of weaving new forms of sociality to replace the lost professional links. What architects proposed instead was a new form of mobility created by architecture itself and symbolized by a flagship project, another ramp, a spiraling car park proposed by Preston Scott Cohen. That park had two noticeable properties. First, it was not so much intended for providing parking places to cars as it was for allowing an incessant circulation linking the town to the element and symbol of mobility, the river. Second, the dynamism engendered by this circulation was intended to have a rebound effect on the building and progressively transform the parking areas into social and cultural venues. This is an interesting turnaround, because in the time of Krutikov, architecture found an inspiration in the transformation of the means of transport, which was itself part of the dynamic of social progress carried out by industrial development. In a reverse way now, the circulation of the cars is engaged to serve an architectural project which works as a kind of substitute for the lost dynamic of industrial production and social progress. Well, this seems to mark a return to an authoritarian conception of architecture, which, for some critical minds from Detroit, also means its subservience to power and capital. However, it must be reminded that those projects were no plans for urban renovation. They were only, quote, speculative proposals destined for imagining the future. This is why, here too, the profile on a plain surface best conveys the sense of mobility that is searched for. As for the Jussieu Library, it was never built, no more than Constance's New Babylon, whose apartments should have been made of modular elements, allowing the inhabitants to invent continuously new combinations of those elements. No more than Le Corbusier's Radiant City, Krutikov's Flying City, L. Lisinski's Horizontal Skyscraper, or Bright's Bodecker City. But one should not draw from this the opposite conclusion, that architecture has mostly become a matter of ideas, texts, and drawings on two-dimensional surfaces, apart from the reality of the three-dimensional world where buildings are erected. The fact is that reality itself is always mediatized by a sense of the real, which is mostly framed by words and images displayed on surfaces. Many texts, drawings, and projects, which remained on thin sheets of paper, nevertheless contributed to the formation of that sense of the real, that symbolic space within which one measures the distance between the construction of buildings and the construction of a common sensible world. Well, the aesthetic revolution gave a crucial importance to to the measurement of that distance. Well, of course, the operation has become much more problematic, since the architectural desire for movement is no more supported by a phase in the movement of history. In that situation, art, not only architecture, but art in general, tends to work as a substitute for the withdrawal of political and social struggle. And architecture takes a prominent part in that shift. It doesn't endeavor any longer to build radiant cities. Instead, it tends to become an art of the representation of the common space, which works as a substitute for the lost landscape of industry and social struggle. The fact that so many futurists, post-futurists, deconstructive of biomorphic projects take on today the form of installations, scenes in spaces of exhibition, which are themselves disused factories or warehouses, is part of the complex redistribution of times and activities that makes our present. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.